ーパーワンダーボーイ。
I haven't really talked about the SG-1000's computer counterpart, the SC-3000 here, and that is because the Video Works series is focused strictly on console gaming. If I dabbled on the PC side of things, I'd never even make it past NES Works 1988. But here we have a case that straddles the divide between the two platforms. It seems like it should have been made for the computer, but it works just fine on the console as well. It's Sega's Terebi Oekaki board, a graphics drawing tablet for the SG-1000. So, speaking as someone who used to paint on his Coleco Atom by using the horrible ColecoVision controllers, I can say with confidence that this thing is way better, or would be if mine actually worked correctly. That's the trouble with old secondhand hardware. You can't always count on it to work properly. This is me drawing straight lines with my graphic tablet and stylus. Not exactly ideal. But let's imagine we exist in the year 1986 and this thing is fresh out of the box. In that context, what an amazing device. Light pens and graphics tablets were hardly science fiction by the mid-80s. The Plato system had incorporated light pens into its high-resolution displays a decade earlier. However, a graphics tablet for a consumer device at consumer prices in 1986, that's pretty extraordinary. Make no mistake, the Sega graphic tablet has nothing on a modern Wacom tablet or just using a Bluetooth stylus on an iPad. The tablet itself is a simple binary thing, incapable of recognizing levels of pressure. The stylus simply lets you move your cursor around the screen. In order to actually lay down lines, you need to hold the button on the tablet's rim while drawing with the stylus. It's primitive as can be, not unlike Robinson Crusoe, but it's still a pretty neat feature for a game console in this era. The tablet itself is small, lightweight, and comfortable to hold. It connects to the console, surprisingly not through the IDE connector, but rather through the cartridge port. The tablet is hardwired to a cart that contains the program code and plugs into the console. Thankfully, the Terebi Oekaki program itself does allow you to use a standard controller for input, which is helpful for someone who, for example, wants to capture B-roll footage by way of a busted tablet. It's not very elegant, but it's no worse than using a Coleco controller. In a nice touch, the pressure-sensitive space on the tablet is made of clear plastic, so you can use it to trace artwork. Or you can try to anyway. The drawing features here are very limited. You also have the option to use 3 different pen widths. You can also activate a symmetrical mode to mirror your strokes on the opposite side of the screen, turn the cursor into an eraser that reveals the background color, and clear the screen. The biggest limitation to Terebi Oekaki stems unavoidably from the SG-1000's graphical limitations. You can only place 2 colors within a given 8x8 pixel tile of the screen. Trying to add a third color results in a bizarre graphical glitch that almost comes across as ink bleed. This means you need to be very careful about how you paint, largely limiting yourself to monochromatic line work. You can make use of the system's full spectrum, its astounding 15 colors, but how you apply those colors comes with a great many limitations. You can't save your masterpieces, not even to the SR-1000 tape cassette, but perhaps that's to be expected. Sega was already kind of pushing the edge for functionality and interface design on a games console for this era. Although Atari and Apple home computers had enjoyed graphics tablets as early as 1984, those devices never made their way to console hardware, at least not to my awareness. This thing is mostly a novelty these days, and even in 1986 it seems like it would have been hamstrung by its connection to a vanishing platform. But even so, the graphic tablet and Terebi Oekaki were kind of pushing the envelope. In a slightly different reality, we might have seen this concept more fully realized. An upgraded version of the tablet was developed and planned for release by Sega, but sadly never made it past the prototype stage. Back in the day, I think people looked at Master System and saw the Alex Kidd series as the obvious analog to Nintendo's Super Mario. In hindsight though, looking back, it really seems like Wonder Boy holds that place in Sega fans' hearts. I think Sega understood that too, even back in the day. No matter how much SG-1000 diehards longed for a version of Alex Kidd that they too could play, they never got it. But we did, however, get this demake of Wonder Boy. Recently, we've seen SG-1000 games that push the boundaries of what the hardware could do in ways the American ColecoVision, despite its more expansive library, never quite managed due to its earlier demise. The SG-1000 survived into 1987, by which point the collective approach of Japanese developers to home game design had evolved considerably from the simplistic single-screen score chase distractions of the golden age of arcades. But what happens when a game pushes the console too far? The answer to that lies here in Sega's SG-1000 conversion of Escape's arcade hit Wonder Boy. Admirably, the SG-1000 really attempts to punch above its weight class here. Unfortunately, the results are pretty much what you'd expect from a welterweight going after a heavyweight champ. It ends up bruised, bloody, and defeated. Well, maybe that's not entirely fair, but this is the one attempt we've seen by Sega to publish a Pac-Land or Super Mario-style scrolling action platform game on SG-1000, and Wonder Boy demonstrates why. The hardware simply wasn't made for it. Wonder Boy debuted on Sega's System 1 arcade hardware, the same as several other titles we've seen on SG-1000. Think Starjacker, Choplifter, Flicky, and Pitfall 2. Those games ported over to SG-1000 from the System 1 board, which offered roughly comparable power to the Mark III Master System console, with varying degrees of success. Wonder Boy was a level or two of complexity more advanced than any of those earlier games, an attempt to take on Nintendo's massive hit Super Mario Bros. On its own terms, and it's kind of impressive just how much of the original work managed to make its way into this cartridge. At this point though, I think we need to take a brief, digressive trip into fully understanding just how differently Sega and Nintendo's 8-bit hardware landed in Japan versus the West, and how different those respective audiences' expectations were for those machines. You'll have noticed here and in NES Works Gaiden that the games that accompanied the SG-1000 and Famicom for the first couple of years of their lives felt very much as though they belonged to an older generation of game design and thinking. I mean, the SG-1000 shared its hardware spec with ColecoVision, which was the most advanced of the pre-crash American consoles. But it was undeniably a pre-crash console. The Famicom offered considerably more impressive capabilities, but even so, few games in its first couple of years of life actually took advantage of key features like hardware-level scrolling, 5-channel audio with support for analog-to-digital sampling, and expansible software paging. The Famicom had the potential to give us games like Mega Man 5 and Kirby's Adventure, but even putting aside those games' reliance on advanced mapper chips, the basic fact of the matter is that the thinking behind game design that complex and sophisticated simply didn't exist in 1983 or 84. The arrival of games like Super Mario Bros., Capcom's Ghosts and Goblins, and Hudson's messy but ambitious Challenger at the end of 1985 opened up an entirely new way of thinking for game creators and players alike. But in America and Europe, we didn't have Sega or Nintendo home consoles before we had Super Mario Bros. The Japanese home audience's expectations were calibrated to the standards of July 1983 releases like Donkey Kong and Starjacker. In the US, Super Mario Bros. Shipped alongside the console. As a result, Americans treated Mario as the baseline for their expectations of this new console generation. We tolerated other black box games, and the more advanced ones like Excitebike, Kung Fu, and maybe Balloon Fight became fan favorites. But for players who were there from the start, those older works were fine, even kind of fun. But it was difficult not to look at Mario and see what the hardware could do, and we expected more as a result. For those who came into the NES even later, once the console hit mass market dominance in 1988, those earlier games were even more difficult to appreciate, which is why belated localizations like City Connection and Xevious tend to find a lot less love among the NES fanbase than among their Famicom-owning peers. But in the Japanese market, games like Super Mario Bros. Had experienced several years of build-up, and shops and homes alike were full of dozens upon dozens of those so-called older generation games that preceded it. So with that in mind, it's important to realize that you need to look at Wonder Boy for SG-1000 as a culmination rather than an embarrassment. Sure, the Famicom's 1986 library contained quite a few releases that grossly outperformed this edition of Wonder Boy, but within the context of this system, Wonder Boy was practically a revelation. I can't imagine anyone who owned an SG-1000 back in the day deluded themselves into thinking it had any technical advantages over Famicom, but with Wonder Boy, Sega gave its loyal holdouts a game that almost feels like it could have been on Famicom. Look at all that Wonder Boy does. It contains 5 entire scrolling stages, packed with platform jumping, moving scenery, deadly monsters, power-ups, even bosses. If you didn't know what Wonder Boy was supposed to be like, this cartridge would have been damn impressive, sitting right alongside the castle in terms of, I can't believe my little SG-1000 is doing this. So that's the fair view. The cold pragmatist view, on the other hand, isn't quite so flattering. The original Wonder Boy in arcades offered fast-paced, ratchet-scrolling action across dozens of levels, each packed with secrets. The developer, Escape, happily wore its influences on its sleeve. Players dashed across flat plains beneath blue skies before venturing into menacing caverns to fight 8 mostly identical bosses, gathered scattered collectibles, and occasionally sprang into the sky for bonus rounds. The game had Super Mario Bros. Wannabe written all over it, and the creators didn't even care who knew it. That was really the point, to out-Mario Mario, to take Nintendo's best-selling concept and turn it into a purer, more challenging arcade-style action experience. So yes, you can collect power-ups, eggs, not mushrooms, that allow you to fling a projectile in a decaying arc. Axes, not fireballs. And yes, you hold the attack button in order to run faster, allowing you to leap further and higher. Yes, you gain power-ups that render you invincible, allowing you to power through all hazards for a few seconds. And yes, there are exactly 32 stages, the same number as in Super Mario Bros. However, each of these features has its own interesting twist. The collectible items, fruit, don't add up to give you extra lives, they help sustain your current life, preventing the stamina meter at the top of the screen from draining away. Your invincibility power takes the form of a fairy, which feels like a nod to Super Mario Bros.' own inspiration or precursor, Pac-Land, and she allows you to smash up non-enemy obstacles like rocks and bonfires. And instead of the power-up that allows you to survive a bump into a hazard simply making you look larger, the skateboard power-up in Wonder Boy changes the moment-to-moment gameplay by briefly turning the action into an auto-scroller. In short, it is literally Sega's answer to Nintendo's game. Well, Escape's answer, since Sega only owned the rights to the main character and the series name. But they made the most of that ownership by immediately porting the game to SG-1000, or at least creating a loose approximation thereof. The original arcade Wonder Boy looked a lot nicer than the SG-1000 release. The juddering, monochromatic sprites here are a step removed from Nintendo's disposable Game & Watch line, a comparison that becomes evident when you see those ghost-like octopuses leap from the water. Equally juddering is the scrolling, which has an almost seasickness-inducing stop-start quality. It almost makes you wish for Ninja Princess-style scrolling, in which the screen shifts in large leaps. Now, the big downside to the Ninja Princess approach to screen movement, as we saw last episode, comes down to the way it causes enemies to blindside you when the viewpoint leaps massively forward. When you scroll to the screen in Ninja Princess, you frequently found yourself right in the face of enemies who couldn't be seen a moment before. That's a terrible way for a fast-paced scrolling action platformer to handle enemy spawn points, of course, and in theory, Wonder Boy's shaky tile-by-tile scrolling should give you enough time to spot and dodge enemies. That's in theory. In practice, that doesn't quite work out. Certain enemies have a maddening tendency not to appear on screen until they're just a few tiles ahead of your protagonist, sometimes not even showing up until you've already made a leap over an obstacle and can only watch yourself careen into the bad guy helplessly. This is no different than the jump scroll style of Ninja Princess, and it's maddening. Worse, it doesn't have any basis and technical limitations, so you really can't see any logic behind this design outside of the developers attempting to pad a brief game by making it shockingly unfair. See, 5 distinct levels is a pretty impressive feat for an SG-1000 game, especially when one of those stages was newly created for this adaptation. But in comparison to the original arcade version of Wonder Boy and its 32 massive levels, each one subdivided into 4 substages, a mere 5 levels feels worse than anemic. If this were a blood cell count, Wonder Boy would be dead. But good luck actually completing all 5 stages. This conversion is hard, and not for the right reasons. The original Wonder Boy had some pretty quirky physics, with a lot of inertia to your movement, but it felt downright graceful compared to the SG-1000 version. Protagonist TomTom still has the same combination of dynamic jump control and deadly forward momentum, but those elements don't pair well with the stilted screen scrolling and the half-tile movement of the hero, a trait we've seen in many other SG-1000 games. Maneuvering onto platforms and leaping over enemies is a hair-pulling affair here, with edge detection seemingly determined by random luck. Unsurprisingly, Sega elected to drop the skateboard power-up for this conversion. I can't imagine how hellish an auto-scrolling feature would be in a game with such fussy controls and frightful collision detection. Also missing in action are the hidden bonus dolls from the arcade game, the fairy power-up that allows you to plow through enemies invincibly, and the hidden bonus stages. In fact, the only hidden secret I managed to unearth was an enticing space which clearly contained some sort of invisible bonus, but that bonus unfortunately turned out to be a warp back to the beginning of the stage. It might seem folly to bring such a robust and sophisticated arcade creation to SG-1000, a system best suited for games from about 5 years earlier. If Wonder Boy wanted to be Super Mario Bros., this would be the equivalent of Super Mario Bros. Special, an ill-advised conversion forced to make radical structural changes in order to function at all. In the West, this Wonder Boy is a mere historic curiosity. Americans and Europeans mostly know Wonder Boy from its Master System conversion, which did a much better job of bringing the arcade material home. Actually, North Americans generally know Wonder Boy best from its NES conversion, but that's a different episode altogether. And there was also Revenge of Drancon, a conversion of a conversion, arcade to Master System to Game Gear, that feels equally compromised to the SG-1000 game due to the Game Gear's miserly pixel resolution. But note that in Japan, Wonder Boy for Mark III wouldn't arrive until 1987. For SG-1000 fans and Mark III owners who didn't mind extremely poor color palettes, this was Wonder Boy's home premiere. And considering the hardware limitations it labored under, it could have been a lot worse. This is another hang on 2 situation, though in this case the naming makes a little more sense. Rather than being positioned as a sequel, this Wonder Boy was simply called Wonder Boy. The Mark III release shipped under the name Super Wonder Boy, fittingly enough. This adaptation is far from the worst thing ever, despite how easy it is to take an ahistoric approach and compare it to the later Master System or NES games. Wonder Boy gave SG-1000 owners the closest thing they'd ever experienced to a game in the vein of the Super Mario-style platformers that had begun to assert their dominance over home consoles as of 1986, and that counts for something. Of course, it didn't hurt that once Super Wonder Boy shipped, Sega had a great sales pitch for upgrading to Mark III. Sure, you could play Wonder Boy on your old console, but look how much better life could be. And the final entry in the SG-1000 Champion Sports Series looks curiously familiar. Almost as though Champion Billiards started life as a completely different game and was just given the Champion title in an attempt at corporate synergy and branding for a platform that was just about to vanish. As any NES Works viewer will immediately intuit, Champion Billiards is actually just Lunar Pool, or rather Lunar Ball, the MSX game on which the later NES game built upon. For Compile's final contribution to SG-1000, they took their MSX pool creation and rebranded it to fit within Sega's Champion line. And the result is so much better and more entertaining than any of the other Champion games, outside of ice hockey, that you feel almost embarrassed for the likes of Champion Kendo. Champion Billiards consists of 50 tables of increasingly elaborate design. Only the first table looks like proper billiards. After that, the tables have more in common with a mini-golf course. They adopt weird shapes, feature outlandish hazards, include variable elevation, and many other bizarre traits that you definitely would not see in action at your local smoky dive bar. Champion Billiards does feel considerably less feature-rich than the NES game. You can't choose your starting table, you can't customize the table's friction, and it has fewer tables. Since you could only play level by level until you run out of cue balls, you quickly grow tired of the first few tables and tend to experience a play loop where you become quite adept at the early tables and then arrive at a tricky new layout that chews through your spare cue balls before you come to terms with the mechanics needed to conquer it. That's a bit tiresome. Still, it's quite an impressive creation here in SG-1000, especially from a technical perspective. The balls obey a slick set of physics rules, and they move smoothly as they carom around the table. Far cry from the staggered half-tile movement seen in so many other SG-1000 games. We've come a long way from Sega Flipper. There's nothing surprising about this one, but it's quite good and makes a far more impressive capper to the Champion Sports line and to SG-1000's 1986 lineup than Champion Kendo did. Of course, this is just about the end of the line for SG-1000, so Champion Billiards sees Compile ending their long relationship with this hardware. Well, sort of. Even though the SG-1000's time has come to an end, Compile would continue to develop for MSX and MSX2 well into 1991. And of course, while Compile would probably become most revered for their NES shooters, like Zanuck, The Guardian Legend, Gunnak, and so forth, they would continue to collaborate with Sega for years to come, right up until the point that overconfident and overly ambitious expansion plans would bankrupt Compile and allow Sega to snatch up the rights to the Puyo Puyo series. And that wraps it up for SG-1000 in 1986. Next time, the end.